Please welcome Verity Stothard, front-end developer at Grow Super.
Good morning. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Verity Stothard, and I'm a web developer from Sydney, Australia. And today, I'm going to be talking about why no code does not mean no development. This is my little dog, Alfie, who's back at home. He's a gorgeous little thing, but he's an absolute terror. I am actually a self-taught web developer. I've been a developer for about 4 years now, and I started my career when I graduated from a business degree and just really couldn't see my path in that area. And so I actually just went all in on learning web development. It took me 3 months of intensive, full-time, just obsessive study and building everything I possibly could. And at the end of that 3 months, I actually managed to land my first job. And I remember the feeling of getting that call saying that I had been hired, and I just couldn't believe that this bet that I had put on myself had actually paid off. And since then, I've been through many, many times the emotional cycle of change, which some of you may have heard before, but I only got made aware of it recently by another developer called Ali Spatel, and I especially love the label of stage 3 at the very bottom of the cycle, which is the valley of despair, which I think just beautifully sums up the feeling of when you're learning something new or you're going through a new experience and you just feel like you're never going to come out the other side, you're never going to get to the end of this challenge, but of course we always eventually do. And we learn some really, really important lessons in doing so. So today, I would really like to bring to you and offer to you the lessons that I've learned in my time as a web developer, because tools like Webflow and no-code tools really sit at an interesting intersection where they've been built for people who don't come from traditional web development backgrounds, but in order to use them well and to use them at scale, you do still need to have an understanding and appreciation for development best practices and development workflow. So before I get too deep into some of those lessons that I've learned, I'd like first to talk a little bit on what is, in my opinion, good web development. In my experience so far, I've come to form the opinion that good web development comes down to empathy. Having a strong amount of empathy and a concern for the developer experience is going to lead you to create much cleaner, more maintainable, hopefully bug-free code. And you ask any developer you know, they'll be able to tell you a story of an unempathetic developer that they've worked with. And this is the sort of person who will build features or projects for themselves without any particular regard for the team that they're working with, the product as a whole, or the vision of the product going forward. But empathetic development is the opposite of that. You're building considering the person who's going to use it after you. So I thought I would show you something that I have actually built recently, which I put together very quickly to demonstrate for my workplace, Grow Super, and back in Australia, the use of UX when building forms. And if that sentence makes no sense to you, don't worry, it's not important. But as you hopefully can see in this example, we have just a form tag, some input fields. If we scroll down, we have a submit button, and at the bottom of the page, we have some functions to handle what we're going to do with the form, right? So even if you don't know anything about UX, you don't know anything about HTML or JavaScript, you should be able to open this file and deduce that when we first load the page, we're getting any data that we currently have on the user, and we're bringing it into this file. We're then up in our input fields. You can see that we are actually mapping the current data into the input field so they can edit it. And then when they click submit, we've just got a simple handle function that sends the data off wherever we want it to go, right? So you don't need to be a developer to understand that this is a form getting data, allowing the user to edit it, and sending it off, and that's the goal. Now, working within development teams for the last few years, I also have come to learn that a strong development workflow and good web development starts long before the developer ever touches the tools, whether that's a text editor or a no-code tool, it doesn't matter. And in order to set your developer up for success, there are 3 main areas I believe you need to have locked down before you begin building your product. The first one is clarity. It's probably a little bit self-explanatory, but you need to know what you're building in order to build it, right? Having very clear designs that have a consistent design language, perhaps some sort of interactive prototype to make the translation between the developer and the designer much easier, is going to help with making sure that everybody's on the same page when they're building. So you're not building something, getting halfway, and then kind of realizing, oh wait, no, that's not what I was meant to do. Project scope is a very important one when you're building anything at all. And scope creep in particular is the bane of any developer's existence. I'm sure anyone here who's ever worked in a maker job has had a conversation along the lines of, oh, hey, by the way, I know you've already started, but can we just add this extra feature, and could we maybe make it do this as well? And I know the deadline's Wednesday, but could you just hack something together? That's a very dangerous thing if your goal is to produce good good development, because your initial intent and your initial plan for building whatever it is that you're building is getting kind of sidelined by all these new requirements. Now, most of us don't exist in a vacuum. Things are going to change, and we're going to have realizations and learnings as we go of how things could be done better. But my recommendation in that case would be to version your development releases. So say your client comes to you and they say they want beautiful, glowing input fields that you click on them and fireworks go off. That's fantastic. That would probably be amazing for the user, but it's not business critical. So we can put that aside to version 2, make sure that version 1 is released to the user, and we get some good, solid user feedback before we go ahead and add those bells and whistles. The third one is very dear to my heart, and that is a good kickoff meeting before any work starts. In an ideal world, you would have everyone who is involved in the particular feature or the project that you're building would sit in a room together, and they will talk through what is going to be done and what you're aiming to achieve. This is particularly valuable in relation to my first point on clarity, and something that I've experienced personally, where I have begun development on a feature and made unintentional assumptions on how something should work based on a flat design with a few annotations. And a recent example that I've had of this is actually this design here. My company is a superannuation company, and this is a component where people can update their investment allocations. And so when I received this design and I read through the tickets and all the annotations on the design, I made the assumption that the first 2 charts down the bottom should actually be related to the columns that are in the form above. But after, I would say, a week and a half of development, my project manager just happened to say something off slightly that didn't work with that assumption, and I realized, hang on, this is not what you intended. And that could have so easily have been avoided if we had sat together with him and the designer to talk through exactly where all this data was coming from and what it represents. Sorry. Cool. So we've done all the pre-work. Everybody knows what they're doing. It's time for us to start building. The first thing that you're, of course, going to want to do is build your base and your foundation. You wouldn't build a house on sand. You shouldn't build your projects on one either. Your base should cover everything from fonts, sizes, colors, anything that's going to get used throughout your project, and create that sort of consistent design language and the consistent user experience. You shouldn't, for example, be dropping paragraph tags on the page and altering font sizes in every single place that they're used. Once you have your foundation built and ready to go, something I personally like to do is to build out utilities. In my day-to-day development workflow, I actually use an approach called utility classes, which is quite a popular thing in front-end development these days, and that is where you create a series of CSS classes that handle one styling rule. So you can see here some examples of the most common ones that I use. I have things like text colors, borders, backgrounds, display settings, margins, things like that. And while this is sort of probably more of a hybrid approach to a utility-based approach, The way that I would use this in a tool like Webflow is to have my first class in the designer be the sort of named component class, and then use these utility classes as combinators. So say I had a hero section at the very top of my page, I would have a class hero section and then use combinators to set the text color white, the margin 0 auto, background to purple, whatever it is. Once we have our foundation, we have our utilities, maybe we've built a couple components, the next thing is going to be to create visibility for yourself and your team. I'm sure plenty of you have gone on holiday for a month at some point and come back and thought, what the hell, I don't remember how to do my job. And so a page like this is really, really useful. This is just a very, very simple example of one that just shows things like we have text colors, we have typography, we have like the way that we've created our utility classes. And you could make this as complex or as simple as you like, but it just means that anybody who then joins your team doesn't need to spend a long time acclimatizing to the project. They can come to this page and they can see all your documentation for everything they have available to them. The next one is kind of more of a warning. Global really does mean global, and you do need to have an understanding of CSS specificity when using some of the great features of tools like Webflow, where you can add in. We have like an example here of adding in custom CSS in the head of the document. You can also do it in embeds. And this is something I have actually seen in my real career, where a colleague of mine, well, actually, we don't know who it was that did it, but they added in some custom code in this kind of area. And you can see here I've written text white, which is kind of like a utility class. But then the color is being set to orange and the font size is being set to 100 pixels, which is not great. So when we actually save this and we go into our designer, you can see that we have our heading 1 and we have the class text white applied to it. But in the designer, nothing looks crazy, right? We go into our styling section. We can see we've got our class applied, but we've got the color white and the font size 38 pixels, so everything looks fine. And the reason for this is, of course, that the designer can't detect what we've written in our custom code until we publish it. So when we click publish and we go to our publish page, everything looks a bit crazy. You're not going to miss this, right? Like, that looks insane. But the example that I saw was actually that somebody at some point had defined that everything in the body and the HTML element, so everything, should have the font size of 62%, right? So we publish the page and everything kind of shrinks. And it took them days to track down that code because in the head of the document there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines of CSS that was all global. When we open up the dev tools here, we can see we have our H1, we have got our text white class applied, but it's getting overridden by that global code, and that's what was happening with the 62%. That's quite hard to track down when you've got hundreds and hundreds of lines of code. So following on from that point, my next recommendation is keeping like concerns together. I have an example here of a testimonial slider that I built, or that I added to the page, and I've just added some custom CSS to style it up the way that my client would like it to appear. And keeping it embedded in with the component that you're working on is just going to make it so much easier to track down when you want to make changes or track down bugs in the future, rather than having it extracted out into all different places in the project. Ideally, you would be able to just open up this component and see everything that you need in that one place. The next one is name everything and absolutely everything. If I see another navigator that is a div, an image, a container, a slider, with all the CSS styling being applied to those element level, the elements, I think I might actually lose my mind. It's very frustrating. When you study CSS and you learn about CSS best practice, generally you wouldn't apply styling to element level tags unless you intend for it to be applicable globally, or at least within the scope of the parent class. So I would always recommend having your first class being a descriptive class. So you can see I have hero section, hero image, key point section. So even without having to click into every single element, I can get a feel for where I am. And then when I'm tracking down styles, it makes things a lot easier. I don't need to be trying to dig through all these different elements. The next one is probably a bit of Web Development 101, but I wanted to cover it anyway in case we have anybody who's more of a newbie to this sort of thing. And that is just recognizing and accepting that the internet is just a bunch of different shaped rectangles. So when you are breaking down a design, it's really helpful to think about it in this way. I have the example here of the Code Conf website. And if we break this down, we can see that we just have a rectangle for navigation, one for hero, and then if we break it down further, we have 3 in the navigation, all equally spaced. We have a container rectangle in the hero content, one to the left, and then all these shapes on the right that look like they're not contained by rectangles, they're actually just pretending they are. They're all just sitting there neatly in their little rectangle container, and then they're getting absolutely positioned by using CSS and a combination of CSS and JavaScript. The next one is seemingly a small one, but it really does make such a difference to your web development workflow. And that is having a consistent strategy for how you apply spacing to everything in your projects. So I personally follow the thought process that a component should only control its internal spacing. So you can see here I have my little Alfie with his name and his description, and the only spacing we have in this component are related to the image and the text. I do have a little bit of a gutter on either side, but you could even take this out. And the reason that I do this is because you don't know where this component is going to get placed on your document. So when you pick this up and you place it in a layout, it shouldn't be affected, right? You would use the container of the component to set the layout spacing. So no matter what comes before it or what comes after it, it doesn't matter because your component doesn't care. It only cares about its internal spacing. The last one is building a landing page builder. I know that we have a talk coming up later on today about landing page builders and using them at scale, so I'm only going to cover this briefly. But a use case that I see over and over again for a tool like Webflow is enabling marketing teams within businesses. In one of my previous workplaces, we had our marketing teams use Webflow to take care of the marketing website, and then the development team took care of building the product, and that worked really, really well. But one of the issues that we found quite early on was that the marketing team would need a landing page for a particular campaign. It would work really well, and then in a week's time, they would come to us and they would say, we need the same landing page, but just ever so slightly different. So rather than just copy-pasting that page and making a few changes here and there to make it fit, a way that you can go about it is actually using the CMS to create a landing page builder. So I have here I've created a collection called landing pages with 2 items, and you can see that I have the feature image and the feature body, and then I've just created a simple select box with 2 options for layout. And then in our page, we're going to use this option to actually determine how the content gets rendered on the page. So you can see here on the side, it might be a little bit small actually, but up on the side there I have 2 collection lists, and they're named after the layout that they are going to use. And down to the side here, I have a filter set so that we're only showing the collection list item that is specific to this landing page, but we're also filtering only on the list item that has the correct selected option from the dropdown. And using this method, we can have the same collection item or the same list rendering 2 different layouts on the page, which I'm sure you can imagine. This is a very simple example, but if you were to build this at scale and you were to have, say, 2, 3, however many different ways that you could render this same information, it's going to enable your marketing team to be able to just so quickly just click through the CMS and just create these really unique landing pages. Cool, so we have a bunch of different things that hopefully you can work into your development workflow. But one part of development workflow that I think doesn't get enough attention is actually the reality of living with technical debt. For anybody who hasn't heard that phrase before, technical debt is what you accrue when you are, say, building for a deadline and you do things in the quickest way possible, just trying to meet the deadline, but maybe not even that. Maybe you just don't know better. You're working with the tools that you have available to you right now. The problem with technical debt is that it will continue to accrue if it goes unaddressed. So some of my learnings and tips for handling technical debt is to be aware that a quick hack culture, the first one is to be aware that a quick hack culture is really hard to recover from. And once a company or your boss or a client has become accustomed to you meeting 2-day, 3-day deadlines for work that should actually take 3 weeks, it's going to be very hard for you to then go to them and say, actually, I need more time. They're going to be confused, like, why, you've always been able to do this so quickly, why do you suddenly need more time? So it's very important to always make sure to very openly and honestly communicate that this is how long it will take if I do things well. This is how long it will take for me to address the tech debt that we currently have, and this is why it's important. And that kind of goes into my next point of don't hack and forget. If you find yourself in a situation where you do just have to take on technical debt, you know it's not the best way, but if you meet this deadline, then you might win this client, and if you win the client, then you'll have more time, right? That's fine, and that's the reality of web development sometimes. But I would recommend keeping a backlog or some kind of documentation that makes note of all the things you know that you need to go back and address at some point. So if we take, for example, the landing page builder, maybe in order to meet your deadline, you just create 3 static pages they're all completely independent of each other. They look good, they work, we ship it off, we meet the deadline, fantastic. But in 6 months' time, when you have 50 landing pages and you are having to update every single one of them individually, things are going to start to get really, really, really slow. So you need to have some kind of documentation that outlines why that decision was made, what the implications are, and what you can do to address it, but also maybe even an estimation of how long you think it will take to address it, right? It's going to take you maybe 3 days to update 50 landing pages, or you could spend 3 days going back and converting it over to use the CMS. And the third one is to consider the true cost of technical debt. And the true cost, from my experience, is, of course, you're going to create fragile and unreliable code or no code. In the case of the 62% example that I gave before, right? We had a situation where that debt was accrued, but it wasn't addressed for a very long time. So we ended up with a situation where this issue was introduced, and as we continue to work and we create new things, everybody who was just having to deal with this issue, right, and manually set all the font sizes so that they would actually show up as what we intended them to be, which then slows down development time because you shouldn't need to be doing that for a start, but then when you actually say, okay, enough is enough, I'm going to fix this problem, I'm going to track it down, you take out the line that says 62%, but then you've got to go through every single place where the font was manually set and fix it up to pay back the debt. The final point being poor developer experience, right? I talk a lot about empathetic code, and it's something that I really, really believe in. And the developer experience is, it's so key for the longevity of your product. If you want to retain talented developers and keep them feeling creative and motivated and determined to build good products, you don't want them to be coming up against these walls every step of the way. People who want to build good products don't want to be dealing with manually setting font sizes and tracking down landing pages, right? So paying back technical debt or at least keeping it at bay and having a strategy for how it's going to be taken care of is incredibly important for keeping that developer experience strong and keeping people feeling empowered. Thank you so much for listening to my tips. You can find me everywhere at Verity Stothard, and I do actually have an online course teaching the fundamentals of HTML and CSS if you'd like to learn more. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the day.